to Alan to talk about his research around knowledge activism, and we can see how this all fits together, and then we'll move to John, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. So Alan, I'm going to share your slides, I think, and I will set that up, but I just wanted to introduce you with your bio that you're currently an honorary research professor with the sociology department at Memorial University, having retired from your full-time position in 2019, and still involved in research, though, thankfully for us, that you can come and share your knowledge. And some recent publications include a co-edited book called Multidisciplinary Perspectives on Post-Traumatic Stress, a sole-authored book, The Subjectivities and Politics of Occupational Risk, and another co-authored book, Closing the Enforcement Gap, Improving Employment Standards Protections, plus some recent journal articles on capital and class and social and legal studies, which specifically address worker representation in occupational health and safety, which is some of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to share your slides, and maybe you can introduce yourself further. Thanks.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Val. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, especially since it's May 1st. Thanks to Val and OCAL for inviting me, although I do have to admit it's a little early for me, as I'm now living the lazy retired life on Vancouver Island. Congratulations, of course, to John on his anniversary and his incredible contributions. My talk today is about knowledge activism and its relevance or connection to the prevention of stress and mental health problems in the workplace. I imagine some or even most of you have heard this KA term before this webinar, given that the OFL, OCAL, and several unions, including, of course, USW, have made some use of the concept in their training and communications. But just to be clear what we are talking about, let me begin by outlining how I define KA based on past research. Slide 2, please. Although my early research on mining in the 1980s identified some important differences in the way reps operated, it wasn't until I and colleagues did research in the auto sector in 2003-05 that we first coined the term knowledge activism. We defined worker OHS reps as those who strategically collect and employ information and knowledge to promote and achieve improvements in workplace health and safety, using both qualitative interview data and large sample survey data. A later study, which actually involved John, of multiple occupations done in 2012-2013, offered further evidence that relative to other types of representation, KA reps were much more effective at challenging management control and gaining substantial improvements in OHS conditions. Researchers in the UK, Australia, South Africa, and Europe have subsequently found evidence supporting KA as an effective form of OHS representation. Based on our research, we went on to identify several common or distinctive operational characteristics, as shown in slide 3. And I'll just briefly go over those. Reps tend to build knowledge and understanding, use them to strategically and tactically make hazard claims, and manage challenge management positions. They work within and outside the committee context. They recognize and understand the political demands of representation and understand the power is an incredibly important aspect of what they do. Educate and involve and organize workers as part of the way in which they mobilize power. They educate and persuade managers and supervisors in an ongoing way. They are assertive and persistent, involved in short and long-term strategies. They provide solutions rather than just complaining about issues. They recognize the value of inspections. That's in the next slide. The value of inspections, committee meetings, reports, and minutes, but they use them as tools to achieve change. They don't let them define their representative role in these terms. They recognize the limitations of current OHS law and rep work rights, but they learn how to use the law, rights, and regulations where they provide leverage. And they also often seek to get formal management and union support for more dedicated paid time for representation, as well as other rights or powers that can help them. and build and implement political strategies to achieve those gains. Okay, on slide 5. Now that we have some idea of what KA is and how KAs conduct themselves, what does knowledge activism, and I'll use the short term KA as I go through it, what does KA have to do with mental health? There are 2 main points I want to make today. The first revolves around the important role that knowledge activism can and I think does play in addressing and reducing workplace stress and mental health problems. My second point speaks to the stress and mental health challenges that KAs themselves are experiencing in their role as representatives, and the need for unions and other labor organizations to pay more attention to reducing activist stress and supporting their mental health. Before saying anything more, I want to first acknowledge that our original research did not focus specifically on worker rep stress and mental health. And indeed, most of our data was about the rep's efforts to prevent physical injuries and disease. This was largely a reflection of the time when the research was being done. When I first started to do research on representation in mining in the 1980s, right up to the rep research in the auto sector in the early 2000s, the labor movement recognition of stress and mental health issues was at its early stages. As such, very few reps at this juncture voiced any awareness of stress issues as something they saw themselves addressing in their committees or in their other activities. However, by the time we did the more major survey and interview study in 2012-14, violence and harassment were becoming more significant labor and public concerns, as Sophie's pointed out, which fueled increasing recognition that stress and mental health should be on the Joint Committee agenda. As well, since this later research included a range of white-collar and blue-collar occupations, there were definite occupational differences in the recognition of violence harassment occurring at that time. However, what was also evident, next slide, Pete, please. What was also evident in the 2012-14 research was that the KAs, to some extent across the occupational categories, were more likely to voice awareness of violence and harassment as OHS issues, and were actively trying to address the issues. A recognition of the broader scope of stress and mental health prevention beyond violence and harassment was still largely underdeveloped in most workplaces, but some KAs were distinctive in that they voiced a recognition of the need to expand their work and their committee's work in this area. These findings that KAs were early adopters of violence, harassment, and stress issues are consistent with our general data on KAs. That is, that knowledge activists are oriented towards research, education, and knowledge development. They're more likely to recognize new and emerging areas of concern, and accordingly are more likely to play an important role in shifting how occupational health is defined and perceived by employers, unions, the public, and the state. So although still at its early stages, it was the KA reps in 2012-13-14 who were reporting struggles with managers, government inspectors, and sometimes even their own union and fellow workers around getting them to pay more attention to stress and its impacts. I'm less certain whether the management reluctance to acknowledge and address stress as a critical OHS issue is as much a problem today as it was then, given the lack of current research specifically asking this question. But I do know from recent study I did with Eric Tucker during COVID that many nursing and teacher reps were still struggling to get managers to pay serious attention to stress as a key consequence of COVID. This and my own personal experience as a rep in my university makes me think that we still have a long way to go in getting stress and mental health addressed. But the more significant point I'm trying to make here is that if stress prevention and treatment in the workplace is going to progress beyond the government and employer emphasis on violence and harassment, KAs are best placed to have a significant impact in making that happen. For the same reasons, they tend to be more effective in addressing conventional physical or chemical hazards. To confirm whether they are doing so and whether they are being successful certainly requires research dedicated to these questions, but I would suggest that KAs are likely to be critical leaders in this effort. Moreover, when unions and other labor organizations provide education and research support on stress definitions, measurement, and prevention, the kinds of activities that John's been engaged in for the last several years, it is likely that KA who will be most responsive, in as much as they are generally more innovative and sensitive to new information and opportunities to expand their understanding. Inasmuch as KAs take on an educational and persuasive approach to change, I would also argue that they can be a critical force for broader cultural and regulative change in the way workplace stress is defined, regulated, and addressed. They may well have already played a critical role in how things have changed thus far, but I acknowledge we need more research on this. I'm hoping that John's presentation today will speak at least in part to this. Of course, KAs can't achieve this goal of expanding the recognition and prevention of work stress by themselves as isolated representatives working in their respective workplaces. Organizational and network connections are crucial to any large-scale social change. But one of the major reasons organized labor may fall short of this goal is that the reps themselves are vulnerable to stress and burnout, a problem which labor organizations are best placed to address and need to address. Next slide, please. Now I have to again qualify my remarks. To my knowledge, there are no specific studies on the stress or mental health of OHS representatives. And as noted, this was not a focus of our original research. However, there is a substantial stress research literature on activists in other social justice areas such as anti-racism, the environment, human rights, etc. And much of that literature suggests that significant stress and burnout go hand in hand with activism. Moreover, while we didn't design our research to look at rep stress, the worker representatives we interviewed often provided evidence consistent with the general literature on activism, in that many reps, including KAs, reported experiencing substantial stress, anxiety, frustration, and even depression as they carried out their activities. Some worried whether they could continue for much longer without burning out. And although we've never tracked this specifically, there were indications that retention and turnover of worker representatives was a significant problem. For example, in one of our studies, when we tried to follow up with KA reps a year later, we discovered that several had either quit or had been effectively forced out of their jobs and had lost their employment. Many reps in all the studies told us that they had doubts about their ability to continue, or more explicitly, they didn't expect to continue much longer in their role because of the workload and stress. In terms of the sources of stress, workload was often a major problem. Next slide, please. In terms of sources of stress, workload was a major problem for KAs because they were trying to do their regular jobs as well as the committee research, education, political work, etc., that they thought was important, frequently without formal paid time allowances. And even when they were given a certain amount of time, the hours they put in far exceeded those required by law. This also often meant they were spending less time with their families, which became another source of conflict and strain for some. Although KAs tended to have more success than other reps, KAs, knowledge activists and other reps often talked about the frustration they experienced in trying to get management to make changes and complained about their limited power to make necessary improvements and the slow pace of change. Reps also complained to us about feeling threatened and harassed, either by individual managers and supervisors or as a part of a more concerted management campaign to get them to quit or back down. Inasmuch as KAs took on more significant OHS issues, it is less than surprising to find that KAs often experienced management pushback and reprisals. Conflicts with workers as well were often reported by reps as causing concern, and many cited the lack of support from their union and other representatives. Reps often talked about the ways in which managers and supervisors tried to undermine their efforts and their relationships with workers by trying to pin cutbacks, restrictions on overtime, wage restrictions, etc., on OHS changes that the reps had been addressing. In these contexts, of course, reps said they felt isolated and underappreciated. Next slide, please. While KAs were certainly among the reps who expressed concerns about workload and other stresses arising from their representation and activism, it is important to note that some KAs had been active for quite some time when we interviewed them, 5 or 10 years or even more, and they expressed a commitment to stay in their role for a longer term. It was evident then that they were much more comfortable and confident in their position than other KAs and reps. This recognizes that either the stress in some workplaces was less substantial, or some KA reps were better equipped or protected than others to cope with the stress. I suggest that the differences in stress levels among KAs in particular reflect a bit of both. In some workplaces, it was clear that KAs, often the reps with less experience, were in a constant struggle with management, and as I said, sometimes with workers as well. While in others, reps reported a more collaborative or cooperative relationship, which also tended to translate in a pattern of more easily won successes. And with those successes, often a greater degree of respect and support from workers. Some researchers in the OHS area have rightly argued that the differences in conflict and outcomes reflects the fact that some firms are better managed than others with stronger built-in commitments to occupational health and safety. And there is certainly something to that. But I think it's also important to note that some of these less stressful relationships with managers and workers were at least partly a consequence of the work done by KAs over the preceding years to develop trust and legitimacy with management in the workplace. This was reflected in accounts of some veteran reps who talked about their efforts to build relationships and the improvements they'd seen in relations over time. Thus, it is important to recognize that the features that make knowledge activism more effective as a form of worker representation are also the same features that can help reps to manage or limit the stress associated with their activism. As any experienced KA knows, there are always going to be conflicts between labor and capital over OHS issues. But as we've argued elsewhere, knowledge activism offers reps a strategic and tactical framework which can yield positive worker gains while relying less on the confrontational politics that some reps employ. This in itself can help to reduce the stress, and to the extent that KAs also tend to be more effective or successful, success too is an important moderator of stress, in part because it reinforces their confidence, their relationships with workers, and their sense of meaning and accomplishment. But I emphasize again that the use of knowledge activist strategies does not mean that there are no conflicts and stress. Even for the most successful veteran KAs, their workplaces and labor processes and their relations were always subject to a variety of changes and pressures, which tended to introduce new OHS threats and or challenge the historical work the KAs had done to build relationships. And in that sense, all reps are subject to ongoing as well as new sources of stress, which they have to resolve or cope with. So while there are clearly differences between workplaces in the stress they present to reps, it does appear that some KAs are better positioned or able to manage or cope with stress better than other KAs and reps. To the extent that this translates into greater rep longevity and all the benefits that go with rep experience and knowledge, it is important for us to understand what makes some KAs more resilient and or protected from others. For example, in our data, it does appear that some KAs had somewhat different attitudes about their activities and how they judge their impact. That is, some recognize that change often takes time and patience, and as such, they experience less frustration and disappointment when their gains were gradual or initially limited. When asked what advice they would give reps just starting their position, several reps pointed out that it was important for them not to get angry or frustrated, not only because expressing that anger often led to similar response from managers, but also because the reps recognized that it was not good for their own mental health to be angry all the time. As one put it, I think the main part is don't get too upset about things. Some may take a month or 3 months to get fixed, because it usually comes around and is fixed in a reasonable amount of time. So get along with your boss, your foreman, whatever. Just play it cool. Don't get too upset, because you know what? It doesn't help. So there are kinds of emotional labor that some reps employ for themselves and in their relationships, which help them to better manage the slow pace of change and also continue to keep their relations with management and workers on an even keel. Okay, the next slide, please. However, the capacity of knowledge activists and other reps to cope with stress is not just on them. It's also a reflection of the social and other supports they have available to them. Lots of evidence in the general activist literature show that ability of reps to persist with their activism is strongly linked to the relationships they have with the organizations in which they are working. Some of these linkages are just basic emotional supports, providing channels for activists to express their concerns and get feedback and confirmation from others. But it's also about the range of resources that representatives gain through their organizational relationships. With respect to worker reps, labor unions, worker centers, and with respect to worker reps, labor unions, worker centers, and OHS centers are all relevant organizations here. For example, in our findings, KAs often talked about the crucial information and advice they had obtained from organizations like OCAL. But even in this situation, sometimes it was the emotional support, just the connection with somebody who knew something else about health and safety, that was part of that exchange that seemed to make the difference in their confidence and self-respect. When Eric Tucker and I did our recent study on worker voice during COVID, reps differed in the extent to which they felt they were supported by their union. Those that felt supported expressed considerable satisfaction with the help and support they received, even when they were still not successful in getting management to listen to them. Not surprisingly, those who weren't well connected to their union or other organizations like OPAL expressed more concerns that they felt stressed and uncertain about their situation and insecure about whether they were doing what was needed. Critically, they felt more isolated, and consequently, these were the reps who began to question their continued involvement. Of course, reps themselves must do some of the work needed to build and maintain those relationships. And as our evidence shows, this is a key feature of KAs. Most of them actively work to develop their relationships, networks, and connections within and outside their workplaces. However, we also have to ask, what can labor organizations do to ensure that reps are better connected and supported so they get both the emotional support they need and the other resources that give them the confidence and tools they need to succeed? Here are a few suggestions that I have to make. This is the final slide. Although I'm sure there are other ways that organizations can help. open and maintain periodic and emergency two-way communications. This was something that we found in the COVID study quite a bit. Help reps to build and maintain rep networks within and between workplaces. So these are direct connections between reps in different workplaces and even within the same workplace. Expand and strengthen rep education programs which address rep stress and mental health. So not just educate reps about mental health issues, but also about the importance of taking care of themselves and about getting support and so on. Make professional mental health counseling services available to reps, recognize and address their concerns and requests about workload, training, and education. There's lots of things, of course, that can be done through collective bargaining. These issues often fall by the wayside in collective bargaining, of course, as many people know, but they're important issues to address. Okay, I'll end it here. And as I said, I hope my comments lead into John's presentation to some extent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. Fascinating. Sorry, I have a blank screen on my, my computer, but hopefully you guys can all see something else. And much appreciated. I don't know if anybody has any questions right now for Alan, or should we move into John's presentation and then we can discuss the whole at the end of that.